Hey everybody, Dave here. Today we're talking about Blue Prism object design. The focus of the video is going to be the one object per screen rule compared to making highly dynamic objects. Now, Blue Prism from, I don't know how many years ago, they have always been suggesting that you use the one object per screen rule when you're deciding how many objects do I create for this particular application? And I think that that is still a very solid best practice. Really start from there, and then you think of a reason why to do it differently rather than coming up with a reason to do the one object per screen rule. I have been introduced more recently, I guess it's been a few years now, to this more highly dynamic version of objects by Digital Workforce, or DWF. You should absolutely hire them if you need a consulting firm. I have no financial ties to them whatsoever, so this is just purely me thinking their developers are great and you should use them. The way they make objects is to make them very highly dynamic, and their actions are highly dynamic and super reusable across the entire application. This doesn't work for every application, so I'm not saying that they do this everywhere. They do it when it makes sense. But I've seen this happen several times in several different applications now, and I really like it actually. It's not a complete replacement for the one object per screen rule. It's not like you do away with one of them. I think that you always keep them both as approaches that you could use. So in this video, this is going to be kind of a case study using HubSpot, which is a common customer relationship management tool. If you look up top free CRM tools, this will probably be one of them. So I'm going to use that as an example because I want you to be able to go to the website and kind of click through it and think about it as well. So what I want to do though is start with the one object per screen rule. We're going to come up with an object model or a set of object models with the various actions that we want to use and talk through that. And then after we've done the one object per screen rule, I want to do dynamic objects, and we'll come up with that. I'm actually going to create some objects in Blue Prism, but I'm not going to fill them out. I'm not going to like make the actions functional. We're just going to sort of come up with the planning and design aspect to it. I want to be very clear. I am not trying to suggest that Blue Prism's best practice is not good enough. I just think that there are more ways you can also use. And I want to read a quote directly from the Blue Prism best practices document. They say, there are no hard and fast rules regarding how to break up an application's functionality into objects within Blue Prism, other than you can't have too many objects, only too few. I think that that is a really good way to say it. Your biggest problem you want to avoid is having one object that's massive and has every action that you could ever need. You might make a massive object when you're using dynamic objects, but that's very different, a very different thing from what Blue Prism is talking about here. Let's get into this, and I want to know what you think. Feel free to leave comments disagreeing or agreeing with me. Let me know what you think about how you build objects. And with that, I don't know how to transition sometimes into the content, so I'm just gonna like, before we actually create any object models, let's look at the case study, the application that we are going to be automating. Remember, I'm not actually going to fully make the objects, but we're just going to stub them out. The website is called HubSpot.com, and you can go to app.hubspot.com. You can create a free account. This is not a paid account. You can see it says upgrade up here. I went through the basic sign up, like it gives you some wizards, like you got to fill out some options. For one of the options, if you want sales, marketing, or customer service, I chose customer service, and I don't remember any of the other things I chose. So if you're trying to get yours, if you want to go just like try this out and compare with me, then you could choose customer service, and I don't remember the others, and it should give you some sample data to work with. But you could create your own data, and I think you'd still see the same things that I do. And let me click around the application a little bit, show you the specific screens that I'll be working with. I'm going to go over to CRM and click this and go over here, and I'm going to be working with contacts, companies, and tickets. These are very similar screens to each other, which you'll see in just a second. And I can actually click between them. So I can choose any of these initially, and then I can get to the other screens. So I'm going to choose contacts. So inside of contacts, you can see that we have a table. There's some different views that are like these tabs up here. You've also got a search field, a create contact button. We've got a table of results, and we could probably click on this to go to a specific contact. And so some of these, probably a lot of these things we would need to use if we were automating it for real. And we might even need to work with the pagination down here by changing how many are displayed per page or going to the next page and that kind of stuff. But I am going to try to keep it relatively simple. So we're going to leave a lot of that out of scope. And so I just want to be clear, I'm not going to go over every single bit of functionality you might need. This is just pretending like where we need to interact with certain elements on the screen. What I'm going to do though, so we can have all three kinds of screens open at the same time, is I'm going to go up here and copy this URL and I'm going to paste it into 2 new tabs. Okay, so now I've done that. We have contacts open in 3 different tabs. I'm going to go to the middle one and change that to companies. So this is just like going over here and going to CRM and then going to companies, but I'm going to hit this drop down, go to companies, and then go to this 3rd tab, and I'm going to change this one to tickets. Okay, so now we've got our 3 screens, our 3 main screens that we want to interact with, and we do still need to interact with a further screen. So let's go into contacts over here, and then down at the bottom, I'm going to middle click on this record right here, and it's going to open up a new screen. Inside of here, this is like the contact's details. So it's a specific contact, a specific record, and we're looking at here. I'm going to go over to companies and do the same thing. I'm going to middle click. You can also right click and do open link a new tab actually. That opens it up here. This is that record open. And let's see if we have a ticket. Yep, we have a ticket as well. So I'm going to middle click on that one to open it up. Now we have 6 tabs open. And what I would always encourage whenever you're trying to come up with an object design, you should just manually go click through the whole application, try to totally understand it, create some records if you're allowed to in that system, if it's a test system, and try to really understand what its functionality is from a manual user's perspective, or I guess from a business user's perspective, doing it manually. In this case, I've already done that, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here on screen showing you like, oh, if you click this, it does that and whatever else. Things like, what does it do when I click between these 2 tabs? I've already done that effort, and I've compared the different screens. And what I've found is that this table for contacts is exactly the same thing as this table for companies, except for the column names. So I guess it's not exactly the same thing. But as far as the the button names and everything else, these different pages are like carbon copies of each other. Did the developers create one and then copy paste it? Or is it a layout that they're reusing across those? I have no idea how it's designed. I suspect it's a layout of some kind that each of these pages is reusing, and they have inputs to it, and it's behaving differently for each screen. But from my perspective as an RPA developer, I don't really have to know that. It might help to know that, but I don't have to know that. What I'm going to do at first is build an object model that is 1 object per screen, so that what I'll end up creating is we're going to create an object for contacts, an object for companies, an object for tickets, an object for basic actions to launch and close and stuff, and then an object for each of the details screens. So we've got the contact details, the company's details, and the ticket details. So that's 7 objects that I would create for a 1 object per screen approach. If I were doing this dynamically, we'll see that after I do the 1 object per screen way. But the dynamic way, I think that we would only create 1 object, and we might call that basic actions. Worst case, we might create a basic actions object that does limited things like launch, login, close, and then another object we might actually call HubSpot dynamic actions. And it would have everything we'd possibly need, like write to a text field, read from a text field, all the things that you can imagine, click buttons and stuff like that. Giving you kind of an overview of this and showing you what the different screens look like. So now let's go over and build ourselves a sort of object model design for a 1 object per screen. So in this section, what we're going to do is make a set of objects for the 1 object per screen. I actually named this in a weird way. Let's rename this group to 1 object per screen. I want this to be at the top for now. So I'm going to put underscore, and I want another object group that we're going to call dynamic objects. Let's see if that will go up to the top. Yeah. Okay. So now we've got 1 object per screen and dynamic objects. We're going to create some objects in here right now. The first object that we want to create is going to be the basic actions object. So the name of this application is HubSpot. So I'm going to name it like this. And then I'm going to put basic actions. Something that I've thought about more recently is adding an underscore to the beginning of like this part of the object so that this gets sorted alphabetically and underscores will go to the top. I think that it looks a little weird, but it does really nicely. You could also just put like an A or something, but I think this is, makes it kind of readable. So I'm going to hit next. I'm not going to give any description, but normally you would. I'm not going to open the business object just yet. Okay, so we've got basic actions right here. This is where we're going to put actions like launch and login and stuff like that. Let's go ahead and also create the name of 1 screen. I'm going to show you in a little bit why I wouldn't create all of the objects initially. I am like sort of planning and building at the same time here, and normally you wouldn't do that. So in this case, I'm going to pretend like I am really building, and I'm going to just create one screen action, and then I'll probably duplicate it and use it in the others. So what I'm going to do is create object. We'll call this HubSpot contacts, and finish. And then now that I think about it, we also should go ahead and create HubSpot contacts, contact details, or we could call it, yeah, that's fine, contact details. And I'm not going to open it. Now, what these relate to are, basic actions. It's always going to launch and log in and that kind of stuff. But then contacts is going to be related to this screen that has like the search on it, and it has search results and stuff. And then contact details is going to relate to this other screen where we have like a specific record for a contact. And this is where I was also almost going to call it like contact record or contacts record or something like that. But I think contact details is pretty clear. And so these are the sort of different example objects we're going to have. I'm going to fill out some actions in each of these, and then we're going to duplicate those for the other two and then change some words, and you'll see what the overall design would be. So let's go into basic actions first. We're going to create some actions. Let's just call this first one launch. And then just in case, we're going to have attach. Actually, we definitely have to have attach, but we probably won't publish this. So let's go ahead and publish launch. Just going to connect these so there's no errors. Let's create another one. We're going to call this navigate to home. Now, I've looked around in this. There's not really a good home page on this that I've found, but this is something I commonly do, and it's not the best thing ever, but it's definitely reliable in that the goal is to get you back to some state where you can start from to work on the next queue item or whatever. And so I want to give something kind of obvious to other developers to know, okay, this is what I should call when I'm like, I just want to get back to a good starting state. And then ideally this action would handle that. There's another thing that I noticed on this actually it's all pages. Yeah, so this is regardless of whether it's inside of a details screen. Oh, no. Okay, it's inside of a details screen. Okay, yeah, so never mind. We won't put that in the basic actions object. Okay, so something I was looking at when I'm trying to decide what actions to put in this, I was initially thinking in the basic actions object that I would put an action that shows and hides the sidebar, but I was thinking that it's on all screens, and that's what I would normally, if it's on all screens, I would do that. But it looks like it's not on all screens. And as far as one object per screen, you could argue, whether this should be in the basic actions because it's also in every single other type of details screen. So, but that's kind of getting to the concept of being very reusable and dynamic, but that's something you could put in basic actions. So I guess let's go ahead and do it. Since it's on multiple different screens, it's not on all screens, but it's on certain ones. We're going to go add an action called show sidebar and connect start to end, publish it. Let's create another one called hide sidebar. Connect it, and then we need to publish. Okay, by this point, eventually you're going to get to the point where you can't see them all like that. So you can hit the drop down, and that way we're going to kind of look at it like this whenever we're trying to think about like what all have we created in here. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the last obvious ones, which would be logout. And we also need to close the application. Now, you might have other ways of closing things. It might be a more generic way of closing things, but I'm just going with like, hey, standard Blue Prism practice. We need a launch. Oh, we don't have a login. Now that I say that, I was going to say we need to have a launch, a login. Okay, so we don't have login. Publish. Okay, so I'm kind of stubbing this out. And since I've connected the start to the end stage and I click errors, check errors, you can see up here whether or not there's any problems. I'm going to hit repair all. And now when I check for errors, there's nothing wrong with the object. And that feels clean to start with. So let's go ahead and save this object. Stubbed out initial actions. Now we can minimize this. Let's go over here and we're going to go to the next one. So not alphabetically, but this one. Let's open up our contacts object. This is going to be for the contact screen. So let's go over to here. Now in the contact screen, we could do lots of different things. I've chosen a few specific pieces of functionality that we want to have because let's say our business process that we're automating has those requirements. So I'm only going to create the actions necessary to support that automation. There might be times where you should build more into it, but I've chosen not to because I only want to support what is actually necessary and future developers can add to it. Now, when I build these actions though, they need to be reusable for other automations, of course. Let's use this action 1 and change its name to attach because we need all of our objects to have an attach. And we'll connect it. I'm not going to publish this because typically you call attach from inside of other actions. The next action I'll create is navigate because we need to be able to get to the contacts. This is something that I am not sure that I normally would actually do. I'm doing it for the purpose of this video, but I think normally what I would do is put the navigation into the basic actions object or create a dedicated object for navigation. In this case, I don't think it's that big of a deal because navigation in this system is relatively simplistic and you can navigate from any screen. So I'm just going to, even though this is a little bit awkward, I'm going to give the responsibility to each object to navigate to itself, to navigate to its own screen. I'm going to publish this. The next thing that I want to do is you can look in here, you can see that there are multiple, it says add view over here. These are views, so they kind of have different ways of viewing the data, or they might have filters on them and stuff like that. And so part of the business process might be to go to a certain filter and use that. So maybe I'm supposed to go to my customers and deal with that, or I'm supposed to go to VIP customers and do something with that. It could be anything. So I'm going to create an action to navigate for that. So we're going to call this select contacts view. And I don't have to have the word contacts in there, but I'm doing it for clarity's sake. And when I call it from the process, it'll automatically be named something that is easy to see. Let's go ahead and publish this. The next thing that I see as I'm kind of working my way down, as I'm looking at the application, I'm looking farther down, I do see a search input here. What I'm going to do is build an action. We're not actually going to build it on screen, but I'm just saying if I were to, in this one object per screen approach, I would create an action called search contacts. And what it would do is take in some kind of text field. So what this should do is like search for like Brian, and then it waits a second and it automatically searches. So that would be the purpose of this action. If in the future that functionality changes, maybe you have to press a button, then I would update this action to handle that. So we got search contacts. Once you search the contacts, you want to read the table. So we need an action to do that. So I'm just going to call it like get contacts table. New get contacts table. And let's publish it. And the last thing I want to do is let's say that we want to have an export table functionality here as well. Maybe for whatever reason we have to search and then export it. And then after that, we need to like click on one of them and do something with it. So let's make an action for export. I'm actually just going to call it export contacts table. And let's publish this. And then the last thing I want to do is be able to select one of these. I think the naming of this could be kind of weird. So I could name this select contact, and that could mean like select this checkbox, or it could mean click on the contact. So let's actually name it open contact. And then this would take some, maybe like a row number, or it would take a name and it would go click on that person's name. It could even call the search action, and then it could go, click on the result that comes up or something. That's kind of a design decision that we'll figure out later. Okay, so this looks like it should be potentially everything I initially need in contacts. You certainly could add others, but you can kind of see where I'm going with this. You have a way to navigate to here. Again, that could be in basic actions. You have a way to select the view that you want, get the table that's here in the page. You have a way to search for certain contacts in order to filter the table. You can export the contacts table, and then you could open a specific contact. You might need more functionality, so you'd add more actions. But it's very, very obvious if somebody needed to update this object to work on the screen. If they come to the screen, it's super obvious how to work with this, what each action does based upon its name. They could also identify, is there any missing functionality? It's very easy to tell. And then testing this would be really easy because it deals specifically with this screen. Okay, so now that I've created that, let's go ahead and save it. Let's say created initial actions. Let's do the same thing again for the, let's go ahead and do it for the other one. So we've got companies and tickets. Let's glance at that really quick and just make sure overall, let's pretend here that the word contacts inside this object, that actually says companies. Can we use this same object, but change the words and it all makes sense? So we need navigate to contacts. So navigate to companies. That makes sense. Select companies view. Okay, it looks like we do have views up here. Let me click into it. It's only got 2 views right now, but it does look like we can add views as well. So let's go back in here and look at this. So select contacts view, search companies. Yep, we've got a search. That makes sense. Get contacts table. So get companies table. That makes sense. Export companies table. Do we have an export button? Yes, we do. And then the last one was open contact. So instead it would say open company or something for whatever result that we want to click on. So that all makes sense to me. And this isn't necessarily something you want to do all the time. I think copy paste can be a dangerous thing. And you might actually go even like create some elements in application modeler and maybe even create, fill out some of these actions to make them fully functional first, fill out your descriptions and stuff like that, and then duplicate the object. You do run the risk of leaving something in the duplicated object that is from the original. So you don't want to see the word contacts in the new one after you've created it. So I'm going to show you what you can do for that. We just need to be cognizant of what the difference is. In this case, the difference is mostly the word contact and contacts should become company and companies. So I'm going to go up here and do File, Save As, and this is to duplicate. I'm going to name this object HubSpot Companies. Go down to wherever we were, 1 object per screen. Next, I'm not going to fill in a description. I'm going to go ahead and say Open Business Object after closing the wizard, but I think it would do it anyways automatically. Next. Okay, so you can see the name of this changed to HubSpot Companies. We are no longer dealing with the contacts anymore. I'm going to close this just to show you. So I'll close this and then reopen HubSpot Companies. Okay, so we've got that back open. And now what I'm going to do is actually, let's see, there's an easier way to do this, but I'm going to edit every piece of it manually. Let's go ahead and change all of the action names to say companies instead of contacts. If you had filled out application modeler, you'd filled out all the actions, this might be more effort. So I'm going to do this, companies. And let's rename here, select companies view. Rename this, search companies. Okay, now if you're watching me do this, you might be thinking, Dave, there was an easier way to handle this. If you knew you were just going to duplicate the object to begin with, why in the world did you put the word contacts in all the actions? You could have just named it search and select view and get table. You're absolutely right. And that's what I normally would do. I just wanted to show you with clearly named actions what this would be like if you truly created totally separate objects. So you absolutely could do what you're probably thinking, which is to name it in such a way that duplicating the object to make it easier. Export companies table. Open company. Let's make sure we named them all. Okay, so let's say that I don't know if I have gotten everything. I can go up here to the search. I need to open this up. To find text, and we'll search for contacts. And let's search for that. Okay, it didn't find contacts. Now let's search for contact. Okay, so it didn't find that either. That's something you can do if you're thinking, okay, I just duplicated this other object. Let me just search for the primary words of that other object, see if my new one has any holdover data in it. and it should search everything in here. Site, data items and like names of stages and all that stuff. So let's go ahead and save this. Duplicated contacts and renamed words. I don't know. Save. Now I should be able to do the exact same thing again. I can do save as HubSpot. I forgot what it's called. Tickets. So we want to name this one HubSpot tickets. Let's go pick one object per screen section or group and then click next. Okay. All right. So we are in the new HubSpot tickets object and we want to rename everything to say tickets instead of companies. Okay. Rename that action. This. Another way to do this is just through XML manipulation. I could definitely have exported the other object, just manipulated the XML and then imported that. But this is not that big of a deal. It doesn't take me that much time. Ticket. Okay. Now, I think that we have finished all of the main objects, like the sort of search objects, contacts, companies, and tickets. So let's save this, created and stubbed out. And now we want to create some objects for the details screen. So I'm going to go to this details screen and obviously I would be comparing this to the process definition document, the PDD, or whatever documentation I have for what do I need to do with the screen, same as I did with the contact screen, the company screen, and whatever else. And depending on what I need, I may or may not do the exact same method that I did for contacts and companies and tickets. And let's say I look at it and I determine, oh, I actually don't need all of the same functionality. So this time, maybe I'll create totally different objects or whatever. In my case, though, I'm just going to go ahead and create the same functionality and not worry about it. We're going to make them sort of exactly the same again. So let's go through that set of steps. I guess I could point out what we're going to work with. What we're going to support is reading or writing any of these fields over here on the left. Same thing inside of companies, reading or writing over here. And then in tickets, reading or writing over here. And then for all three of them, we are going to support clicking overview or activities for these two tabs, overview or activities, overview or activities, and then also reading data highlights and reading recent activities because all of them have those. Okay, so you can actually see that I did a little bit, created a note just to make sure I had something in recent activities, but it should also be capable of reading it if there's nothing there. So we would build it to handle that. The last thing though is that just to show that if there are any differences between the objects, the tickets over here, a specific ticket has a status field, so we need to be able to read and write that field as well. Okay, so we're going to open this contact details object that I already created. I actually forgot I created this already. I tried to create the exact same name just now. Okay, let's minimize this. Okay, so we're going to create a few actions dealing with what I described a little bit ago. We want an action for attach. It's going to remain unpublished and called from the other actions. Here we could create like navigate to contact record, and it could have inputs of like what the person's name is or maybe an ID associated with that person. But I don't really see an easy way to get to here. So I think normally it's going to be through the contacts screen and we'll search for it and then click on it. That's how we're going to get to it. So the specific object dealing with this record doesn't really need to know how to get to this record. The assumption is going to be that we are already on like a contact record or a contact detail, since that's what I've decided to call it. So let's create an action called get contact details. And matter of fact, while I'm at this, because I said earlier that you could make it easier to create one object and then duplicate it for other objects, let's go ahead and do that here. I'm going to name this just get details. And we know that this object is always going to deal with contacts. So it can only get details about contacts. It's going to deal with email, phone number, company name, and it cannot deal with this where it has like company domain name, industry, company owner, because that's companies. That's a totally separate thing. But I'm going to name the action kind of generically so that it's easier to duplicate it. Let's publish this, connect this to here to get rid of the errors. And then I'm also going to create set details. which is just the reverse of get details. And this might have, let's say, however many this is, 7 different inputs. And this one will basically have 7 different outputs, depending on whether you're getting or setting here. Now let's create a navigate to overview tab. Create that action. You could definitely make this more dynamic. It could be like navigate to tab, and then it could take an input of what's the tab name, but we're trying to make this simple. Navigate to activities. And the biggest reason I think this isn't a huge deal is that there's only 2 tabs for now, and all of these only have 2 tabs. Maybe they'll have more in the future, so maybe I would regret the design, but I don't think it's that big of a deal. Navigate to overview tab. Navigate to, I meant to name this activities tab. We also need get data highlights. Publish, and I could use the full name here, like get data highlights, because all of them say data highlights. That's not specific to like what screen we're on or anything. And then one more action for get recent activities. Like this. Okay, now we look at, you can see the names of these actions are very generic. And so it's going to be a lot easier for us to duplicate this object, and that it's going to be really fast to do so. Now, if I had fully created this object, I had elements and I had stuff happening inside of here, it wouldn't be this simple. I would have to do more work because I'd have to actually update my application model or elements and maybe some of the namings and stuff like that. So maybe this is I don't want you to think like, oh, it's going to be that easy. Like there would be some more steps if you did this for real. So we got to save this. Let's see, created, oh wait, no, I had already created this. So set up initial actions. Now that it's saved, I'm going to do file, save as, go to one object per screen, and we're naming this HubSpot company record? Oh no, company details? I actually forgot what I was going to name this, but we'll go with this, company details. And here, now, actually there's nothing else for us to do because when I did the duplication, it automatically changed the name. So that's it. Yeah. So we have our object. Same things, get details, navigate, or get and set details, navigate to the different tabs, get data highlights, get recent activities. Again, if you know that the scope is this specific screen, these slightly generic named actions are like pretty obvious because it's not that hard to realize. Navigate to activities tab. Even if you've never worked with this before, you take a look at the screen for a minute and you'll see activities tab here and you're like, oh, okay, that's what it's referring to. I kind of wish we could do screenshots in Blue Prism, to relate like what does this have to do with, but that would make the object bigger. So let's go ahead and duplicate this one more time. Save. I'm losing my voice a little bit here. So I guess because I've been talking to myself for a couple hours. HubSpot ticket details. And let's save it to the right group. And here we are. So now we have the same actions. Get and set details, navigate to overview tab and activities tab, get data highlights, and get recent activities. I hope this is making it clear how you would make a set of objects based upon the concept of one object per screen. Yes, these are very similar to each other, but this is actually one of those scenarios where, and this is why I chose it, it's hard to decide, do you want to do a dynamic object that can handle any of these screens, or do you want to make one object per screen? It's just one of those applications where it's like, should I? I don't know. But now let's add in the 1 or 2 actions we have left. And this is like kind of a small example of why it's helpful to have separate actions per screen sometimes. So this status field of new or whatever else, this doesn't exist on the other details screens over here. So if I scroll up, it doesn't exist here. It's actually there's also this this open 4 hours. So how long? Open 4 hours. I don't totally understand what that's referring to. Maybe it means more than 4 hours. But anyways, yeah, what does that mean? Open 4 hours. because if I refresh the page, I think it's been, 5 hours. Okay, so that does change. Cool. So that tells us how long the ticket has been open for. And obviously in customer service, you want to try to close tickets as soon as possible. So we might want to deal with that, but I'm not going to create any action for that right now. We're going to deal with reading and writing the status. So let's go back over to ticket details and let's create a new action. We'll call this get status. Just connect this and publish it for now. And then set status. Okay. Publish it. Do this. And let's just check for errors. Oh, right. We needed to do repair all. I'm going to save this stubbed out actions. So this is how I would create a set of objects using the one object per screen approach in HubSpot if I were dealing with these 6 screens and including the basic actions object. I think that this is pretty clean, and I don't think there's anything wrong with this. You could, in fact, and it would not be a problem if you had 60 or 70 more objects in order to support the entire application, assuming eventually you needed to automate every single screen in the application, which I don't think is very common. But if you needed to do more, you could do that, and I think it would be fine. I just went over the one object per screen section. I am losing my voice. It's just going to get worse and worse probably before the end of this video. What I realized when I finished that section and I started working on the dynamic objects section is that actually the way I created basic actions is not different from how I would do it with dynamic objects. So instead of recreating the basic actions object, what I've done is I've just reorganized the folders a little bit. So we've got a folder called HubSpot, which you really should have a folder named after the application itself anyways. I put an underscore here at the beginning of HubSpot just to make it alphabetically like at the top of my list. You wouldn't normally do that. So underneath that, I have a group called dynamic objects and one called one object per screen to just separate these two sections of the video. And this HubSpot basic actions object is outside of both of those. Now, I just to mention, I have an underscore here again for the alphabetizing. So if I had any other objects directly inside of this group, then the basic actions would be above it. But here are the objects that we created in the previous section. These are one object per screen for the 6 different screens that we're interacting with. And what I'm going to do now is create one dynamic object inside of dynamic objects. I'm saying one for now. Maybe I'd create more depending on the scenario, but I'm not going to recreate basic actions. So I want to open that up and show it to you. All right, so we have actions launch, log in, log out, and close, which are and attach, of course, pretty standard for a basic actions object. That's just what should be there all the time. You might need other things. I also added navigate to home in case that ends up making sense, but you don't always need that. But the goal there is let's get us back to some state from which we can work on the next work queue item and just kind of start from a clean slate. Your navigate to home could be named something different and it could do something entirely different, but it's just to get you to a clean slate. Now, I put show sidebar and hide sidebar in here because I did see that in 3 of our 6 screens, we have the sidebar on the right side, and it only deals with like specific entries, specific records. So like a company record has this sidebar on the right side that can be expanded or collapsed, or I guess show or hidden. But I just decided to go ahead and include it in the basic actions object, even though maybe that belongs somewhere else, like inside each of those objects or something like that. I don't know. I think it's fine like this, so I'm going to leave it, and I'm not even going to deal with that functionality in the dynamic objects or object, but it's something I would do. So I'm going to close this, and we are going to create an object. We're going to call this HubSpot Dynamic Actions. Would you name it that for real? I don't know. I think it's pretty good. I think it's kind of clear what it's going for, but you can name it something else. Something I should point out is sometimes you want to like scope your dynamic objects. So maybe you want it to be only for CRM. So while I'm saying that, instead of just saying theoretically, let me actually do that. I'm going to call it HubSpot, and I like space CRM and then dynamic actions. I kind of like that. You could also just call it HubSpot CRM like that. But the point here is that when I build the object, I'm going to force it to be, to have to be inside of the CRM section. Now, is that possible all the time? Maybe not. So maybe I won't actually force it to be, but I'm just encouraging people to only use this object for screens that are inside of CRM. And that way I can reuse it across these 8 different screens, as well as any other screens that have to do with these, you know, like how in contacts, you can click on one of the entries, it takes you to contacts details or whatever. So, you know, maybe this is only going to be across like 16 different screens, but that's pretty good. You could just name it like HubSpot like this, HubSpot dynamic actions. That's perfectly fine. In this case, I'm just doing this because let's say I don't know how the rest of the application works. So I'm going to limit it to this area. Maybe later on I go, oh, what I made actually works across the whole app. Well, then maybe I'll duplicate this object and I'll have a duplicate of just a different name. And then any further updates happen inside of that object. And eventually over time, I would take all my existing automations and make them use that wider scoped object for dynamic actions. It's not pretty, but it would technically work. So I'm going to open up this and let's put this on the right side like the other ones. All right. Now, what do we need to replicate all of our functionality? Instead of thinking about it in terms of like functionality where, you know, we want to perform searches, we want to, we want to navigate to a contact or open a contact. Instead of that, we want to like make it lower level. So let's think about the actual clicks that we're doing and stuff like that. It doesn't mean you can't go higher level than this, but the point of this video is for me to show the highly dynamic actions. And I think this is very common from what I've seen. And I like it. First, we are going to create an attach action because that's standard. We will not publish this. Now, I've glanced around at the pages and I see that we need to click on certain things at different points. At one point, we need to navigate between these views. Instead of select view, I think that I can reuse. Oh, you know what? Is this, let's see what this is. Okay, so this is a span. We're going to try this. I don't know how I feel about this, but we are going to create an action called click text. You could even call it like click span text, but that's starting to make it a little too technical, I think. So let's call it click text. And we would just have to see how reliable this action is. But the goal would be you provide some text and maybe you could wildcard match it. Maybe it's an exact match and it finds it on the page and clicks on that thing. Now that's up to you to make sure it's reliable, but you know, I'm creating actions off the cuff here. So I don't know for sure that that's what I want to do. I also want to do click link because there are times when I want to do that. Let's see, where was that? So sometimes I want to click this. And if I right click inspect, I can see that this is an element type of A. So I know it's a link and it looks like a link too. So we're going to call this one click link. Publish that. Let's also do click button. Let's see, where did we want to click a button? Oh, here, export. Whoops, that's not what I was trying to click on. Let's right click, inspect. Okay, yeah, so inspect here is a button. Where are we at? I lost it. Here, export is a button. Oh my gosh, the page keeps changing on me, so I can't click the right thing. So it's going into here, but what the container element is a button right here. So we can do click button and maybe take an input of text or something. Let's close this. Now I'm going to create a couple of actions that I haven't planned out exactly how this will work, but we're going to call this wait for text. Wait for button. And what I'm going for is creating actions that I may or may not need actually, but I want to go ahead and proof out how it would work in case I did need it. So I want to give, any developers who are trying to use this object as much flexibility as they have to, from the process, decide to call wait for link and then click link. Now, inside of click link, it's going to have a conditional wait for sure. But my thought is there might be times where they want to wait for a link to appear, but they don't actually want to click that link. I don't want to force them into having to implement a certain way. So I'm just trying to give them a little bit of extra flexibility in what they need to do. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call a few actions get and set, but you could use read and write as well, or whatever you feel like. But we're going to go with like get text field. Okay, this is going to read a text field. I also want to set, we're going to call this set text input. So I could change the other one to get text input. For these fields over here, I think that there might be more types of fields than what I'm about to do, but I just want to give you an example. So we just handled like text, right? So like phone number here, email will be handled by get text input and set text input. So the process would call, oh, let me get this text and see that, oh, it's blank. I need to input the phone number. So we set text input, we put the phone number. But there are some down here, like here's a drop down. Maybe that's a search. I don't know, whatever. But let's pretend like that's a drop down. Then I would create an action specifically for that element type. And I found that to work out well. You may not always need to do it this way, but this is what I'm going to do. So, theoretically you could have like get text and set text, and then those actions could dynamically determine, like based upon the label you provide, like, company name, it could go in and determine like, oh, what element type is this? And then go on a certain path to read or write a text field. But in my case, I'm just going to go ahead and force the process to know in advance, like what kind of field is this? Is this a drop down? Is this a text field? Is it a date field? Whatever. So get, what was it? Drop down. We'll call this get drop down text for now. And I constantly rename my actions, so not a big deal. Set drop down text. Now, set does not dictate how we're going to implement it. It could be that you click the drop down and scroll down and find it and click it. It could also be that you directly write it with a write stage, whatever ends up working. But so this is the set get. I don't want you to get confused there. I'm not trying to dictate how it actually works. And then we also need like get date time text. Let's call it get date time input. And set date time input. You don't necessarily need a separate action for date time, but what I'm pretending here is like maybe how it's inputted is weird. It's a special kind of format, and so this will allow you to more easily craft the date time format into whatever's needed for the user interface. That'd be something maybe to go back and figure out later. Maybe it's not necessary, but that's what I'm trying for now. The last couple of actions we need deal with the tables. So we need to be able to read the tables, and we don't need to write to the tables actually. So we only need to read them. Let's go create an action called get table results. Okay, so this would output a collection. What we could even do is if there were multiple tables on a page, which so far I've seen that there aren't, but if there were two tables on a page, what you could do is have an input that's a column name, and then this action would go find a table with that column name in it, and then read that whole table and return it. Another thing you could do is have an input of the column names that you want to return. And so it would go find your table, read all of the table, and then specifically only return back to the process through the output these specific columns you asked for. And that's like, depending on whether you want to write C# or not, like it could be annoying to do that, but it's not that bad. Some of these things I might refer to, it's because I've already created actions for it, or some other people on my team have created actions for it, so it's easier for me to do. But anyway, then let's also create get table results count. What I'm going for here is this count up here. The same thing for companies, 1 record, tickets, 1 record. I want the process to be able to retrieve the total number of tickets. And my expectation is that if we had like 5,000 tickets, then, it shows 25 per page. They could determine how many total there are from this. And then there would be some other counter on here somewhere. I don't know what it would actually show if we had more, but I'm assuming that this determines the total tickets, and then you have a separate count for the total displayed on the current page. So maybe this isn't super clear. Like, is this referring to how many displayed on the current page, or how many, how many total are there? You might need to separate that. But better yet, have 2 different outputs. One that is for this count, and the other that is for the count that's in the table right here. And sometimes that might actually equal each other. You just have to do some testing. So our HubSpot dynamic actions object, it's called HubSpot CRM to limit it to specifically this part of the application. Dynamic actions. Our actions are click text, click link, click button, as well as wait for text, wait for link, and wait for button. Get text input, set text input, same thing for drop down, date time. And then we have an action for get table results, which theoretically, if we can design it properly, it will work for contacts, companies, or tickets. And it doesn't matter which of those that we're on. There might need to be, actually, it's not even just might. Definitely we would need, man, my voice. We definitely would need more actions in this object, no question. We don't have the full set of actions to support the full automation. No, it's not even possible. I would need to create more things, but that's just something you take time to do. And I've taken enough time to think through like, oh, I'm going to need at least these. And I'm pretty confident every single one of these actions is needed for an automation that would traverse these different, 6 screens. So I think that's going to be it for me as far as working on this dynamic actions object. Let me mention a couple things though, in case it's unclear. Let's go to the click button action let me show you something. In case this wasn't clear, what I'm trying to do here is have an input of something like this. Label, and then label. All right, so when somebody calls click button, they would provide a text label of something like export. And then this object, whenever this is called, whatever page is loaded, the object goes and looks for a button on the page called with a label of export. Now, would that actually work? I'm not sure. I'd have to look at exactly how this is designed. But if this button has a label in it, okay, yeah. So I mean, as long as all the buttons are made in a similar way, where I could look for the text that's inside the button. So maybe label isn't the term. Maybe the term is just button text or something. We call it like this: button text, and name this again here, button text. And then we'd use that as part of our XPath, or we couldn't use it in CSS selector, but we could use it in one of the attributes or whatever. Now, same thing for like doing set text input. In this case, we are dealing with like labels and stuff. So this email, for example, we would have an input that's like label, text, stored in label. We'd also have value, text, and value. So these would be our inputs. And so an input for label might be email. The value might be bh@hubspot.com. And then this set text input would go and write that value into this field. Again, like I said, we may not actually have actions that support clicking this edit button so that then we could edit it here. We would probably need to create that and figure out how that would work. So that's something that's not done. And then for get text input, the way that would work is you would have an input. This time you would only have one input. It'd be label, text, label. And then the end stage would have value. And this is your output. So you your input for a label. Maybe it's email. It goes to email, reads the value out of it, puts it into the data item value, and then sends it out the end stage. And by doing this, you kind of just string a bunch of action stages together in Process Studio, just like you normally would, but it's on a sort of more detailed view, more low-level knowledge of the business process, where instead of getting all of these details at once through an action that's just, get details or something, it will instead return you individual specific values. And so you might have a more complex process to accomplish all of that because you need to do each field individually. But overall, I do think I like the dynamic way if the application supports it. From what I can see, this application is extremely standardized from one screen to the next. So it works well for that. But if I clicked around and found that companies is very different from contacts, then I wouldn't necessarily be able to do that. I just kind of be stuck with one object per screen. The other thing you can consider is that you may come across an application where it's consistent in some places and not in others. And that's why I created this object to be named HubSpot CRM, because I'm simulating that either I only know how CRM works, I don't know how the rest work right now, or I know that this is consistent and it's not consistent with the other parts of the application. Just some things to consider. Let's compare and contrast the two designs between one object per screen and dynamic objects. I've created a table where I'm going over a number of different categories that I've made up, such as memory utilization and complexity or object effort. And then for each of these two approaches, coming up with what I think is good or bad about each of them. And if it's good, I put a check mark inside the box. If it's bad, I don't put a check mark inside the box. For memory utilization, I think that both of these methods are actually quite good. It might seem at first that one is bad compared to the other, but it really isn't in practice. So the one object per screen way is saying efficient use of memory because you split up all of your objects in a bunch of different objects and stuff. And so each automation only needs to use a few objects. And since those objects are smaller because they pertain to just one screen, then it's using less memory when it loads it in and runs the automation. The same thing for the dynamic objects, though. It might seem like, so you'll have like one object that has a whole bunch of actions in it because they're reusable actions. But the contents of those actions are typically reusing dynamic elements in Application Modeler, and they are also, those actions are typically very small. It's doing a very limited focus. And so overall, I think that the memory utilization is going to be the same as the one object per screen way, or it's going to be better. Simultaneous development. This is something that is often said as far as like, you make different objects. You can have multiple developers working at the same time. In practice, I've never seen that really matter. I don't know why that would be a big deal. I think that a single developer can build a project, but I know that there have been times where I've seen multiple developers work on a certain project, and so they can work on different objects at the same time. But so I'm going to say that that's a good thing for one object per screen, or that it handles it well. But on dynamic objects, because you kind of just don't have the same problem, because the first developer who makes an object using this dynamic way typically makes almost all the functionality that any developer will need in the future. Now, they won't make all of it. They're probably going to be missing actions, but that means that the next project that comes along that automates the same UI, the same application, that next developer will just evaluate, are we missing any functionality? Are we missing any actions? Like, oh, they didn't used to have a way to set checkboxes or read checkboxes, so let me add that. But now that's created and it never needs to be created again. If it's designed well and you can trust the developer who did that, which I think if you're making dynamic actions is probably an experienced developer, so you can probably trust what they made, then you never have to build anything, like you never have to build that stuff again. You just go build your process and reuse their actions. It's quite nice. Okay, so object effort. This is one that I actually think is really terrible for the one object per screen. And I think anybody who's done it is probably just going to be like, yeah, and it's just a natural, it's just nothing you can do about it. You have to build a new object for every new screen. And from what I've done, when you have a new project, you're typically automating different screens. I've certainly seen one object per screen objects be reused across automations, but that is super rare. We're talking like the home screen, or like it's a navigation object, or it's a search screen or something like that. But it's really hard to come across scenarios where you're reusing screens. So I just think that the benefit that Blue Prism thinks would come out of it doesn't happen often enough, at least in the use cases I have seen, which is admittedly a very small part of everything. I'm just assuming my world is a microcosm that represents what everybody else probably experiences, maybe with some variation, but that's what I think. And then the dynamic objects, though, sometimes you just require, like I was saying before, it requires zero object work at all. You just straight up can build your process without doing anything or doing very little in the object. So because of that, like object effort, as I've given it a check mark, because you almost don't have to do anything sometimes. Now, I should give this a caveat though. When you initially make that first object, man, you got to understand that application. You got to understand it backwards and forwards to know whether or not you can make a dynamic action, or a dynamic object. So that can be kind of a downside, but I think that extra effort right at the beginning is worth it if you're allowed to take that time. So maybe the very first time you build an object that's not reusable, you don't build it highly reusable like this or highly dynamic. Instead, you wait for the second project, and by then you understand the application a lot better. And then maybe you make some dynamic objects, and then you switch the first project to use those. I think I've done that actually. So it's an option. Ease of regression testing. Regression testing in the one object per screen way, it's just much better. There's just hands down way easier to know exactly which screens your object deals with. So it's very easy to test it because it deals with only one screen. When you go with the dynamic objects way, it is really hard to regression test. It's not like you can't. You got to imagine though, if your application has 372 screens, just as an example, you could have 372 objects and you would know which screen each object deals with, but you'd also have 372 objects. So this would be really hard to test though, to make sure that a write text field action or a read checkbox action works across all of those screens. Kind of impossible. I don't want to say impossible, but kind of impossible. However, in practice, I have found it doesn't matter. If you apply this concept in the right applications, it's perfectly fine. And even if it breaks in production, that's common in RPA, so you got to fix it. It's just like it's not that big of a deal. As long as your automation doesn't do the wrong thing, it should have a fail fast mentality. So don't do the wrong thing, only do the right thing or fail. That's fine. And then you just go fix it. And if you build it properly, it probably won't fail that often. So, I don't even know if this is that big of a deal, but it is, in my opinion, the worst thing about dynamic objects. Development time. So it takes, I think, hands down, far more time to develop based upon one object per screen. Overall, I think it still just takes less time to develop using dynamic objects because you've already got the object layer done half the time. When you're talking about that very first project that automates a specific UI, no, you're not necessarily saving time unless, let's say, you were going to go ahead and have to build 15 different objects. I think this dynamic object way would help. Imagine instead of building 15, you build 1 or 2 objects. That you can spend a lot more time in those and still spend less time overall. Reusability, you can somewhat reuse objects, the one object per screen way, but that seems like kind of a pie in the sky type of pipe dreams, whatever you want to call it. Like it's unlikely to actually happen. I know we want to say that this way is very reusable, and it is if you need to reuse those screens. It's just that, so for the potential like hundreds of projects that I've been involved with, I didn't build all of the automations, just to be clear. Like I was just involved in a bunch of projects. I don't really find it to be that reusable when you do the one object per screen method. It's just, you end up having objects that are only ever used by one automation. It's just a thing. Is that bad? No, but it's not what I'd call the most reusable. And then the dynamic objects, obviously it's highly reusable. They're used by every single automation. Like every object is used by every automation, pretty much, except for special use cases. Separation of business logic and application logic. The one object per screen way will have a firm distinction between business logic and application logic. It's like, if you think that that is an important rule, and I'm not saying it's bad to, if you think that's an important rule, then this is the way to go. One object per screen, because the idea is your business logic, your process layer shouldn't even have to worry about how the application works. It should just call the object and go, hey, I want to put in this first name into a new account. I want to put last name into this new account, whatever. And I want you to create this account for me. The process doesn't need to understand how any of that happens. And so I think that's a fair thing to say. And that's why I put a check mark on this. On the dynamic objects, though, you don't have any option but for the process to understand the application logic to some degree. Now, it doesn't have to understand how to work with a checkbox or how to work with a text field, but it needs to understand that there is a difference between a text field and a checkbox. I think you could build it to where it doesn't have to, but I do think that would complicate your design more. So I think there's some wiggle room here, but I do think overall you're going to have a tighter coupling between your process or business logic and your application logic. You could create intermediary objects. Anyway, we're getting into a complex design there. I'm just saying that typically this is how it's going to be. Scenario usage. So this is like what I'm trying to go for here is what kinds of user interfaces, what kinds of applications can you use each of these in? And that's where I'm giving both of these a checkbox, because I'm going to say that one object per screen is best used on user interfaces that don't have consistent designs from one screen to the next. It's just super solid to handle it this way. The other thing is if you're just not sure how the rest of the application is designed, one object per screen is a fantastic way to go. And you might as well just start that way until you discover a reason to change to go to a different way. On the other hand, dynamic objects, while they're not great for UIs that are inconsistent across screens, and I don't mean like just the layout. I'm talking like, say, this label and this text field in one screen is like the text field is nested inside the label. But in another screen, the label is super far away in the HTML from the text field. And you don't have any like solid way to successfully make a single action that can handle both of those scenarios. That's a time where, the dynamic object wouldn't do well. But dynamic objects, though, are really good for user interfaces where it's consistent across different screens of the application. And ideally, it needs to be consistent across all of them. So not 100% necessary, but let's say, how do you interact with a dropdown? Like, where is its label in association with the dropdown itself? How does the dropdown items work? All those kinds of things. If that's consistent across the whole application, then dynamic objects are definitely very applicable there. Definitely very viable. And then the last one here, the complexity, both of them get a check mark. The way I see it is that you're kind of choosing where you want the complexity to be. Do you want it to be in the object where most of the application stuff is just handled, it's wrapped inside of actions, and then your process is a little simpler? Then you would want to go with one object per screen. If you don't mind your processes being more complex, or maybe you want them to be, maybe you want your process to have more control of every little thing that's happening, and your objects be a little less complex as far as like how much it's doing, not like how innovative is the design. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, like, how much is it doing when I say complexity? Then you might want to go with dynamic objects. I don't think that the one object per screen or dynamic objects is better than the other. It just depends on the scenario, what you are personally comfortable with, what your team is comfortable with, and what your development leadership is comfortable with. Okay, you're just going to have to decide based upon what you need, and there is nothing wrong with having one or the other, or just using both now and then. You can even come up with your own kind of like hybrid approach. That's perfectly fine. Do what works for you. After having gone through all this, what do you think about the two different approaches? One object per screen, which is Blue Prism's standard and always has been. Again, it's just the thing they suggest to start with. They're not saying that's the only way. Or the dynamic objects way. Do you think that one is going to be more performant than the other? Do you think it's going to be more complex than the other? Which do you think would be easiest for other developers to use later on if they need to come behind you and maintain your objects and processes? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. And I'm genuinely really interested to see that, because I have no idea what most developers feel like about this, because I kind of stay in my own little world. So let me know what you think. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.